Hello and welcome to my channel. I went to lose gaming. Today we're going to do a full and hopefully extremely comprehensive guide for our favorite pretzel wearing boba drinker, head of the Kamisato clan, Kamisato Ayato. Now in this video I'm going to be going over a lot of stuff for him. I'm going to be going over in detail his kit, his mechanics, even some frame data, and I will also be going over his best builds, artifacts, weapons, and some team ideas that I have for him. So there is a lot to go through, and I guess we're just going to get started with his kit right off the bat. Let's take a look at his kit real quick. We have his normal attack, and here it just has 5 basic attacks as well as a charge attack. Very standard stuff for melee characters. And really, this is absolutely not the focus of his kit, even though the animations look really nice. But really, you can just ignore his normal attacks because they have no bearing on the rest of his kit. Now, this is, in my opinion, the bread and butter or the milk tea and boba of his kit. It is the Kamisato Art Kyoka, his elemental skill. Now, he's got a pretty long description for it, but so there is a lot to say about it, but first let's give a quick demo of it. First you tap E and then you just hold left click and he will do roughly 15 slashes most of the time. Sometimes 16, sometimes some people even say 14 slashes, but for me it's 90% of the time it is 15 slashes that he does. And his water illusion expires at the end. It lasts 6 seconds, has a 12-second cooldown, so therefore it's up about 50% of the time or so. Next, let's talk about the Shinsuiken slashes. Basically, the Shinsuiken slashes are these. Each of these is a Shinsuiken slash. If we take a look at his talents right here, we can see that these are the Shinsuiken slash multipliers, and it's actually a 3-hit combo, 3 hits of Shinsuiken, not just all the same attack. So the next mechanic is the Namisen damage bonus. Now, what this basically does is that it adds flat damage based on his maximum HP. So, and what's also really interesting about this is that it actually has stacks, even though in my opinion it's the stacks are built so quickly that it basically doesn't have any stacks, right? It's basically always at full stacks. Speaking of which, let's talk about that. The full stacks for it is 4 stacks, and this talent here immediately gives you 2 stacks. Since the maximum number of stacks is 4, and each Shinsuiken slash adds a stack, in literally 2 slashes you are at maximum stack. So basically, not only does this make up not the majority of his damage, but on top of that, with how fast the stacks build, it may as well just be at full stacks. So you really don't have to think too hard about this. Just know that there's not much to optimize when it comes to building the stacks for the Namisen damage bonus. So anyway, at talent level 10, with full stacks, you have 4 stacks. That means that it scales at 4.44% of his max HP as flat damage in the damage formula. So just to clarify, for those that may not know, that flat damage is indeed multiplied by Hydra damage, normal attack damage, bonus, which is all the same multiplier, and then as well as crit, and finally elemental mastery stuff like Vape in this situation, as well as the monster's defense and resistance. Okay, so many of you guys might ask, we know that Ayato scales both off of his HP, and we know that he scales both off of his attack stat. So where does most of his damage come from? Now, based on the math that I did for my Kamisato Ayato stats, we can see here that roughly 75% of his damage from the Shinsuiken slashes comes from the attack stat, whereas 25% of his damage comes from his HP stat. So, even though he scales off of both attack and HP, generally speaking, in most situations, it is favorable to build attack with him instead of focusing on HP. So also to clarify that these Shinsuiken slashes are counted as normal attack damage. So in other words, bonuses to normal attack damage like from this weapon, the Hiran Gippaku Futsu, multiplies its damage, as well as from, for example, the Black Sword. The Black Sword also increases the Shinsuiken slash's damage. The next thing about it is that the water illusion can be casted in any direction. By default, if you don't input a direction, he goes backwards. Now, also when the water illusion expires, it deals elemental skill damage. So yeah, it does not do normal attack damage, unfortunately, but it's just a very small amount of damage anyway. So now it also provides super armor. Now, when it comes to its super armor, it seems a little spotty. For example, the Primo Geo Bishop knockbacks will actually knock him back out of the out of his super armor pretty reliably. However, things like Overloaded and the Rifthound Wolves attacks don't appear to really knock him out of his super armor. So, you know, you just kind of have to learn and experiment what monsters have enough knockback to knock him out of his super armor and dodge accordingly. Now, in terms of the energy particles that it generates 1 to 2 energy particles from my observation 3 times during the duration of its 15 Shinsuiken slashes. So it generates, you know, roughly, I'd say on average, basically 4.5 particles or so. Now, I'm not exactly sure what the, you know, distribution of 1 to 2 particles is, but from my experience, it feels like it's about a 50% chance to generate 1 or to generate 2 particles. And I believe the Shinsuiken slashes also have standard ICD. And finally, the water illusion takes about 15 frames to cast. It is very quick. And then after that, each slash takes around 24 frames to come out without attack speed. Let's move on to the next thing, which is his elemental burst, Kamisato Art Suiyu. So Kamisato Art Suiyu does indeed snapshot. It lasts 18 seconds and it has a cooldown of 20 seconds, and with the casting animation of 2 seconds, this means that it basically has 100% uptime. Now this burst operates very similarly to Ganyu's elemental burst, and what's interesting about it is that it seems to tick once every 30 frames, so it does tick noticeably slower than Ganyu's icicles. And also what's worth noting, so 30 frames for those who aren't aware is about once every half a second. It has the same cyclical targeting mechanics that Ganyu's burst has, except instead of Ganyu's burst, which is 5 targets, my observation is that this one targets cyclically between 4 targets. So what this means is that if there are 4 targets within the radius of your elemental burst, it will target each enemy once every 4 hits from it. However, if there are 3 targets, it will target 3 enemies once, and then the 4th one will be randomly targeted in the area. So yeah, that hopefully gives you an idea of how the targeting in it works. So what this means is that you are really encouraged to group enemies up to get the maximum value out of Ayato's elemental burst. And of course, his elemental burst also adds some normal attack damage bonus. It goes up by 1% all the way up until talent level 10, at which point you will have a maximum of 20% normal attack damage bonus. And I'm pretty sure that his elemental burst has standard ICD, which means once every 2.5 seconds or once every 3 hits on an enemy. Okay, so in terms of talent priority, what do I recommend? I personally recommend bringing up his elemental skill the most. I would level this up to as high as you can. And then after that, I would follow this up by the elemental burst. And finally, you don't even need to level his basic attacks, as his basic attacks do not affect his elemental skill damage. Whew, okay, we made it through just his talents. Let's finally dive into the artifact options. Now here is a chart of, you know, some damage maximized math with his artifacts. And for the baseline for this chart, we just have no set bonus. In other words, if you just use 4 pretty copium pieces, you know, just with good substats and mash them together, this is the baseline. Now the 4-piece echoes of an offering set, there are a few ways to kind of calculate its damage. The first is you can account for the average damage that it does, which means that factoring in the average chance to proc the echoes thing, what is the damage output for this set? Now the next way you can kind of calculate this is what if it actually does proc, and finally if it doesn't proc. Now what is the actual average chance for the echoes to proc? It is roughly 50.2% chance. This is verified by math, and I also wrote a little code snippet because I'm terrible at statistics. Now, speaking of what is it activating, how does this activation work? The 4-piece set bonus has a 36% chance to trigger Valley Right, which will increase normal attack damage by 70% of attack. So if we look at the Kamisato Art Kyoka, basically this adds 0.7 onto the multiplier in a way. It's not quite that simple, but most of the time you can kind of simplify it to that. But really what it does is that it adds 70% of Ayato's attack stat at the time as flat damage, you know, same multiplier as this, as well as the HP scaling. And that's what it does. And it does it 36% of the time, assuming you have no stacks. And every time that it fails to trigger, it has 20% chance to do it. So After one hit fails to trigger, the next hit will have a 56% chance, and you keep adding 20% up until you get to 96 to over 100%, at which point it will 100% trigger. Now this part is interesting. This effect will be dispelled 0.05 seconds after a normal attack deals damage. What this basically does is that it means that this will do AoE damage, right? So when it procs, it will affect to every enemy that it actually connects with. This trigger can occur once every 0.2 seconds. This is specifically designed with Ayato in mind because certain characters like Yoimiya, her arrows do hit within less than a 0.2 second window. However, Ayato's attacks, unless you really jack him up with attack speed, and I'm not even sure if even then he will be able to attack faster than this. Unless you get some crazy attack speed stuff, he's not going to be hitting more often than 0.2 seconds, which is... So with all that in mind, I just wanted to break down the mechanics for the Echoes of an Offering. With all that in mind, this artifact set on average will increase his normal attack damage by 30%, and it will increase his burst damage by 9%, the burst of course only being affected by the attack percent that this offers. So what other artifact sets are good on Ayato? Another good option is actually the Gladiator's Finale, as well as the Heart of Depth. So if we take a look at both of these, they basically do something very similar. Just pick and choose whichever one you have a better set for. Now, how does it compare to the Echoes of an Offering? In my opinion, it's not really worth farming the Echoes of an Offering, especially if you have a great Gladiator set or if you have a great Heart of Depth set. That being said though, the Echoes of an Offering does allow you to proc fish, I guess. So looking at the Echoes of an Offering set, you can actually kind of, instead of crit fishing, you can proc fish here. Let's say you get lucky 3 or 4 times in a row with the proc, then this thing will pull very far ahead in comparison to the average damage that the Gladiators as well as the Heart of Depth set outputs. So do keep that in mind that this thing you can proc fish, but of course you can also get unlucky and trigger it once every 4 attacks, right, which would really tank his damage output. So do keep that in mind. The RNG element is both an advantage and a disadvantage. Alright, so next let's talk about the Shimenawa's Reminiscence. Now the Shimenawa's Reminiscence I don't recommend unless you know what you're doing. This thing does have restrictive rotations, however you can absolutely make it work on Ayato. Now unfortunately this only works for also the first rotation, but it does have great average damage output for the first rotation. And the reason why is because after the first rotation, every time you use it, he's going to lose 15 energy and you pretty much will never have his burst back up again, unless you have a second Hydra character on your team. For those that are okay with that kind of, clunkier rotation as well as more advanced playstyle mentality, you can make the Shimenawa's Reminiscence work. So when it comes to hybrid artifact sets like 2-piece gliders, 2-piece Heart of Death, or whatever combination of 2 pieces that you use, they're all kind of mediocre, but they do a tiny bit more burst damage, which is worth keeping in mind. However, if you do, I guess, try to build the burst damage Ayato, you can just use the Emblem of Severed Fates instead. Let's talk about artifact stats. Now, Ayato being an attack percent scaling DPS character, no surprise you want a Hydra damage goblet, attack percent timepiece, and finally as much crit as possible. And I did do some math for you guys to demonstrate, how much damage you gain from each substat roll. And in this situation, it was based on my Ayato, who had 100% crit rate at the time of the calculations. But even with 100% crit rate where you gain less damage from crit stats, assuming you already are at that 1-to-2 crit ratio, we can see here that the crit damage roll adds significantly, adds the most at 2.19% more damage than an attack percent roll, which adds 1.78% damage, and finally an HP percent roll, which only adds 0.76% damage. Keep in mind that in most teams you will have a lot of access to attack percent buffs, like for example Bennett, or just attack buffs, so that dilutes the value of attack rolls. So really the top priority is absolutely the crit rolls, but of course you just take what you can get. And of course you can always tack on some energy recharge. Energy recharge is nice. So I guess in terms of substat priority, it'd be something like crit rolls, then attack percent, then either HP percent or energy recharge. Let's finally move on to Ayato's weapon options, and he's got quite a lot of weapon options. We're going to use the Haran Gappaku with 2 stacks as the baseline. So the Haran Gappaku adds 12% elemental damage bonus, and then when his teammates use elemental skills, he gains a stack on this thing, which each stack provides 20% normal attack bonus when you use an elemental skill. So it's an extremely specific weapon for Ayato's normal attack damage. Now, I guess this isn't a video about the Hirangapaku, but the Hirangapaku outside of Ayato is very, very niche. But for Ayato specifically, it is a very good weapon for him. Now, do keep in mind that being forced to use elemental skills on your teammates can actually be restrictive and waste time. So do keep that in mind that this weapon, normally the signature weapon, I always give a 5 slime rating out of 5 slimes. But because of the restriction that you have to use 2 elemental skills on your teammates, I'm giving this one a 4.5 slime out of 5 slimes. With that being said though, like I said, at Refinement 1 with 2 stacks, this is the baseline, and if you get it to Refinement 5, you'll gain another 23% damage on top of that. And finally, if you have 0 stacks on this thing, so like I said, if your teammates don't use their elemental skills, you'll lose a significant amount of damage, all the way down to 83% of the damage you'd be outputting versus having 2 stacks on this weapon. So with that weapon out of the way, we next have, in my opinion, the second best weapon for Ayato. We have the Primordial Jade Cutter. Now there's multiple reasons why I like this weapon a lot on Ayato, and the first one is that it gives a ton of crit rate. So why is this good? Because Ayato actually has crit damage as an ascension stat. So what this means is that it is very helpful for balancing and building out that amazing crit ratio on Ayato. On top of that, its buffs are completely unconditional. And finally, what's funny about this is that at Refinement 5, my damage maximizer actually favored HP, because HP not only adds attack, but it also adds flat damage based on Ayato's Nami-Sin stacks, if I remember that's what they're called. So yeah, all in all, this is actually an amazing weapon on Kamisato Ayato. Even though I also gave this a 4.5 slime rating out of 5 slimes, I do slightly favor the Hirangapaku just because of its slightly higher damage ceiling, and generally speaking, you want to find opportunities and ways to do more damage. But at the same time, you don't have to use 2 elemental skills on your teammates in order to get the full value out of the Primordial Jade Cutter. The next weapon to talk about is the Mist Splitters Reforged, and this weapon to me looks really similar to the Hirangapaku, but I'm actually red-green colorblind, so I think this thing's purple, but please correct me if I'm wrong. Anyway, the Mist Splitter Reforged, obviously an amazing DPS sword, and this one provides by far the highest amount of burst damage. Unfortunately, one problem with this weapon is that you can only generally have all 3 stacks for the very first elemental skill Infusion, because after you use his elemental burst, then you use his elemental skill, and now you have all 3 stacks. But of course, once the 12-second cooldown is back on his elemental skill for the second round, you won't be able to have his elemental burst again, obviously, right? Because his elemental burst has an 18-second cooldown, whereas his E has a 12-second cooldown. So for the second one, you won't have all 3 stacks. And because it is just slightly cumbersome to kind of maximize the passive on this thing, I am giving this a 4 slime out of 5 slime rating. And on top of that, it also has the crit damage substat. And for Ayato, he's going to have way too much crit damage, and you are going to be clawing at every single crit rate substat that you can possibly get, which is pretty stressful when it comes to artifact farming. The next weapon after that I recommend is actually an interesting option, and that's the Skyward Blade. So the Skyward Blade is the entire reason why I did the math on this chart the way I did, which is the entire E combo. And I didn't clarify earlier, but basically the entire E combo calculates 15 slashes as well as the E explosion from his elemental skill. And the Skyward Blade happens to add attack speed, as well as some bonus crit rate. Now the attack speed, this 10% actually allows Ayato to squeeze in 17 slashes instead of the 15 that he usually gets. And that's actually a huge damage gain in comparison to, you know, most other things that can provide damage. So when Ayato, even at Refinement 1 with the Skyward Blade, manages to get all 17 slashes off, he's actually doing 83% of the Hirangapaku's damage, which is actually pretty impressive. On top of that, this weapon gives a ton of energy recharge as well as a little bit of bonus crit rate, which is very nice. Now do keep in mind that when he does not have the attack speed buff, this weapon does drop significantly. At Refinement 1 it goes down to 74%, but in the end this is a really interesting option for Kamisato Ayato to get the maximum value out of the attack speed buff. And overall I give this weapon a 3.5 slime out of 5 slime rating. So the next weapon to talk about is the Black Sword. Now the Black Sword, it's just a great stat stick and provides a good amount of bonus damage for him. This weapon, solid, has the crit rate substat, which is great for Kamisato Ayato. Like I said, crit damage. Ascension means that he has a ton of crit damage, so any amount of crit rate you can get is great. And I personally am going to give this weapon a 3 slime out of 5 slime rating. Now after this, unfortunately, things start falling apart. Unfortunately, we have, in my opinion, the best free-to-play weapon option, which is the Black Cliff Longsword. Now the Black Cliff Longsword is a bit of a tragedy in that it only does 68% of the damage that the Harangapaku does with 2 stacks. Yeah, which is pretty bad. But you know, of course you can get those kill stacks, but that's situational and unreliable most of the time. But yeah, overall in my opinion, this is his best free-to-play option. Not a great option, but a usable one. And after that, really, I personally can't recommend any of the other weapons left on this list. The Aquila Favonia, I would say, is a usable option. All these weapons at this point I don't really recommend anymore, but you know, they are of course usable in the end. So yeah, just if you don't have any of the weapons above, obviously you can still use them to varying degrees of success. Oh my gosh, this is longer than I expected already, but we are finally getting to his constellations, and this is mostly going to be theory crafting because obviously I haven't activated them, as you can see here. This chart will just show, well, first of all, if you start with the Black Cliff Longsword, we can see here, this is kind of the free-to-play Ayato. It's doing only 68% of the amount of damage that the Refinement 1 Harangapaku is. So yeah, sadly, once you get the Harangapaku, that ends up being a 46% damage gain on his, you know, Shin Suiken normal attack damage, which is huge, huge, huge. Now let's get to his Constellation 1. Constellation 1, the way that I did the math for it is that I basically averaged it out to be 20% increased basic attack damage against enemies. It is unfortunately a not so impactful constellation, only on average increasing his basic attack damage by 9%. This constellation also has more value if you don't use a sword with a lot of basic attack bonuses, like for example, if you're not using the Harangapaku, and let's say you're using the Summit Shaper, or I guess the Jade Cutter. Right, this is a slightly more valuable constellation, but overall not that great, and I'm only going to give this one a 2.5 slime out of 5 slime rating. But because of the fact that it does boost his main source of damage, you know, that's why it's getting a fairly charitable rating. The next is his Constellation 2, which increases the Namisen stack count by 1, and it also interestingly increases his max HP by 50% once he has 3 Namisen stacks. Now, because of how fast it is to build the Namisen stacks, I basically assume that you have 5 stacks, even though, you know, it's a bit of a fallacy. The math here is just very, very slightly off. But we can see here that this adds 16% overall damage to Ayato Shin Suiken slashes. And that's actually a pretty substantial amount. And interestingly, this also makes him tankier, which is slightly amusing to me. But I would give this Constellation 2 a 3.5 slime out of 5 slimes. It's nice to have that increase bonus. And next is his Constellation 3, which adds 3 talent levels to Kamisato Art Kyoka. And just to verify, Kamisato Art Kyoka is indeed his elemental skill, which boosts his Shin Suiken slash damage. So knowing that, this increases his basic attack damage by roughly 16%. Now, you may actually notice that this is less than the usual 18% that most characters gain from their Constellation 3 or Constellation 5. And this is because he has some scaling with his flat HP, right? Or he has the flat damage scaling from both the echoes as well as his HP stat. So because this also increases his elemental skill Shin Suiken slash damage by 16%, I'm also giving this a 3.5 slime rating out of 5 slimes. And interestingly, by the time you have Constellation 3, his Shin Suiken slashes are doing roughly 46% more damage than a Constellation 0 Ayato counterpart. The next constellation is his Constellation 4, and this one provides 15% attack speed. Now this will have varying degrees of effectiveness depending on how much attack speed you already have on your team. Now I'm assuming you have 0% attack speed right now, and with 0% attack speed, he goes from 15 slashes to 17 slashes. And at 17 slashes, this is a 13% increase to his overall damage. Now you may look at this and think, okay, well this is, you know, less damage than, for example, the other ones provide. In my opinion, this deserves a higher rating of 4.5 slimes because this also boosts the rest of your team's normal attack damage, so it's very, very feasible to slot in Yoimiya or even other basic attackers with Kamisato Ayato. On top of that, this increases Ayato's damage as a purely multiplicative source because of the fact whereas the others are more kind of additive onto the attack multiplier. This one just makes him do more attacks, so it multiplies all sorts of his other multipliers by this 13%. And the next constellation is his Constellation 5. This one's simple, it just adds 3 levels to his Q and makes it do a little bit more damage. I'm just going to give this one a 2 slime out of 5 slime rating. This increases his Q damage by 18% total. Constellation 6 is next, and this one is more speculative than the other ones. Based on the wording of this, I'm assuming that these 2 extra Shinsuken slashes do normal attack damage and potentially can activate the, whatchamacallit, echoes of whatever. So, knowing that this is the case, this front loads 900% multiplier for Ayato up front, which is always great to have upfront damage in any situation, right? Generally speaking, front-loaded damage is superior in most situations. In terms of the amount of damage that it increases the overall rotation, it's still pretty significant at around 20%. So I'm gonna have to give this one a 5 slime rating speculatively until, obviously we test it. Now, of course, if it doesn't take into account normal attack multipliers and all that stuff, then yeah, this thing's going to go in the toilet. But, we're just gonna have to test it and wait and see on that. So by Constellation 6, assuming that all my presumptions about his constellations are correct, Ayato is already doing about 2 times the amount of damage with his elemental skill in comparison to a Constellation 0 Ayato. In comparison to, for example, a Blackcliff Longsword wielding Ayato, which I would describe as the quintessential free-to-play Ayato, he is doing nearly 3 times as much damage as a free-to-play Ayato. And finally, of course, we can bring the Haran Gapaku up to Refinement 5, which will increase his damage by another 21%, his elemental skill damage, which, now he's doing 241% of a Constellation 0 Ayato with the Haran Gapaku at Refinement 1. So, yeah, another character that obviously does a ton more damage at Constellation 6 Refinement 5. Okay, so next let's talk about some team compositions for Ayato, and before I go into any specific teams, I do want to mention that Ayato does seem to be able to hit things in Venti's Tornado with his Elemental Burst as well as his Elemental Skill Shinsuken Slashes, so he does have compatibility with Venti in that regard. Now that was just from my limited testing, perhaps tiny enemies at the very top of his Tornado Ayato might whiff, but we'll just have to see. So I want to start off with likely what is going to be many players' bread and butter's Ayato team, which is going to be Ayato version of the international team. I've been calling it the Boba National Team. So far from what I've noticed, I think there are some ways to double swirl Hydro and Pyro, especially with Kazuha. With that being said though, any team where you have copious amounts of Hydro application plus Xiangli is going to succeed. I did an Abyss 12 run with a Sucrose variant of this, and it was extremely easy to 9-star Abyss 12, even with the Blackcliff Longsword on Ayato. This next team is what I call a Boba Brawler build, or the Hyper Ayato build. This build basically tries to amplify Ayato's basic attack damage as much as possible. Bennett, Kazuha, and Yunjin obviously all enhance Ayato's damage by a ton. Having the Freedom Sword on Kazuha pushes it even further beyond, and finally having Constellation 6 Yunjin provides that 12% attack speed. Very powerful. Now I think this will scale extremely well when Ayato has Haran Gapaku, when he has some refinements on it, when he has his constellations. Then, once you multiply the already very high Constellation 6 refinement, whatever, Ayato, he's going to do a ton of damage. However, at Constellation 0 with a Blackcliff Longsword, this team isn't going to perform as well as, for example, the international team. But this team should still be pretty solid and usable even for free-to-play levels of Ayatos. The next team is a dual carry team, and you can either run, for example, Kazuha, or you can run Yunjin. Now, I like the idea of Yunjin more, but this will require some more play testing to really determine. But basically, this is the Exploding Boba team. Here we have 2 essentially main DPS, or normal attack spamming characters, and Yunjin, of course, buffing normal attacks by a lot. And finally, if you do have Ayato's Constellation 4 and Yunjin's Constellation 6, that's 27% attack speed, and that should allow Ayato and Yunjin to Ayato and Yoimiya to quickly dump out Yunjin's stacks, all during a single Bennett burst, which would be very, very impressive. Now, unfortunately, this is a team that will excel far more for whales than anyone else. However, I think it's still probably functional for free-to-plays like a Refinement 1 Rust Yoimiya with a Blackcliff Ayato, but at this point, in my opinion, still the Boba National Team is better. But it should be interesting to try it out, and let me know what you guys think about this team composition. Of course, Ayato being an on-field Hydro character can apply lots of Hydro, and thus he can work well with, Taser teams. Now, finally, you could even try Ayato in a freeze situation. Ayato's Elemental Burst is huge, and it keeps hitting things with Cryo probably pretty good with, for example, something like Venti. You can even pair him up with Ganyu. And you have both their bursts doing quadratic scaling to grouped up enemies inside of Venti's burst, which is very nice. Both their bursts last a very long time. So yes, just, Ayato again being a Hydro character, he's got a ton of teams that he can fit in and a ton of roles that he can fill. Okay, that wraps up this guide video. I've been talking for a very long time. I'm already losing my voice and it's going to be a lot of editing, but hopefully you guys found this extremely detailed guide helpful. Let me know if you guys think it's a little too long. I wanted to convey to you guys everything that I've learned about this character, all the theory crafting I did, all the math that I did, as well as the frame data and some of the mechanics that I've observed. Do keep in mind that this is a day zero mechanics and observations and stuff, so I may have gotten a few details wrong or a bit off, and if you notice that, be sure to leave a comment down below, as well as to check the comments to see if someone or even myself issued a correction to something that I said in this video. And if you like boba like Ayato and I do, be sure to subscribe to showcase your boba appreciation. And as always, I appreciate every single one of you. This is I Win to Lose, signing out.